everybody, welcome to CAF Warbird Tube, the show where we talk about World War II, aviation, history, and so much more. Warbird Tube is produced by the Commemorative Air Force, the world's largest flying museum. Our mission is to educate, inspire, and honor through flight and living history experiences. The CAF began the Warbird movement more than 65 years ago, and thanks to the support of individuals like you, we continue to grow strong. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and now our host, Steve Buss. Thanks for watching and keep 'em flying.
Good evening and welcome everyone to Warbird Tube for tonight. We're going to talk with Dennis Blocker, who discovered his grandfather's story at Iwo Jima and so much more. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. But before we get started, can you do us a favor? If you haven't already done so, please take a second to like, share, or subscribe and make sure you follow us. All right, if you do subscribe on YouTube, click that bell icon and you'll get notifications about new episodes of Warbird Tube when they're posted. Now, as you're watching tonight, you may have some questions. Just type them in the comments section. We'll answer them either during the presentation or before we sign off. And joining me now is Dennis Blocker. And Dennis, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor.
Yeah. Well, tell us a little bit. The book that surrounds your grandfather's story is called The Heart of Hell, but there's so much that goes into the story before we ever get to the book. Where do we start?
Gosh, I guess we start from where my inspiration and love for World War II history. And,
right.
You know, being a military kid, I grew up all over the world and was born into that life. So born in Los Angeles, immediately moved to Guam, lived on Guam for a couple years. What was interesting, I didn't know then, of course, I was a toddler, but Grandpa Lemke actually fought for Guam and was there. Then from Guam, we went to Michigan, and Michigan to San Antonio, and San Antonio to Iceland, and then Iceland to back to San Antonio. My mother cried because she was leaving Iceland and the beautiful weather and knew she was heading back to the face of the sun. She was not excited. So, you know, being a military kid, especially, and what's interesting, Steve, is my actual first movie I ever remember wasn't The Wizard of Oz or Mary Poppins. It was a World War II movie, and it was in Iceland. The base had 2 channels, and of course they're going to show a lot of military movies. And the movie that really just made me, there were 2. One, of course, The Longest Day, but the other one that just really made me fall in love with World War II history was Von Ryan's Express with Frank Sinatra. And there was just something about the British conniving, always trying to escape, the brash Americans who, you know, were, Frank Sinatra's character. And then the Germans who, you know, were just, their uniforms were just, that's what really stuck out to me as a young kid was how sharp they looked, you know.
Right.
So, yeah, that's what got me started into all that was, you know, growing up in the military family.
Well, let's start with your grandfather.
Yeah, Grandpa was a hero of mine, you know, living across the world. We corresponded by letters, and Grandma would send us audio tapes that she would record, little cassette tapes, and we would play those in Iceland or Michigan or wherever we were. We still have those to this day, which of course are treasured now that they're both gone. But, you know, Grandpa being this patriarchal figure in the family and somebody that you can see in this, there's this picture of me with my arm around my grandpa's shoulder. You can see that I'm a lot taller than he is, and I was still going to grow some more. But the way that he's looking at me in that photograph with just such pride and love, and you can see in my face that I'm just so proud of him and to be his grandson. And, you know, sure, I was taller than him, but I looked up to him in every way possible. Yeah.
Did he share a lot of information about his time in the service with
No,
you,
sir. No, he didn't share anything. In latter years, after he had died, my aunts would tell me stories that he had told from time to time, but they were typically like most World War II guys, right? They were the fun times. But he did share a couple things that, you know, figured into the story greatly later and made more sense once I did the research. But, you know, other than the picture of Grandpa in uniform, which was in the house, which Grandma had probably had displayed. No, there was no clue as to what had happened. One of my favorite memories is that I would be, their house was on East Regent Street in Hawthorne, California, Los Angeles. And whenever we went to go over, Grandma would pull out the sleep bed out of the couch. And my bed, even when I became a teenager and I raided the bed, I actually would continue to use the cushions on the floor between the couch and the TV. And Grandma would make me a little spot there. And even as a teenager, she still did that for me, and I insisted on it because it was such a great memory. And one of the first things that I would do in the morning is when I would wake, because Grandpa was in construction and he was up at the crack of dawn, before the dawn. Mm-hmm. And he would be sitting at the table reading his newspaper, and he always had his legs pulled up under him. And he had tremendous dexterity. And that would be one of my favorite memories, would be him teasing Grandma and pinching her butt as she was making breakfast, and her slapping his hand away, saying that there's grandkids in the living room. And I would smile, and then my eyes would close again, because I was looking underneath the bed into the kitchen, and they didn't know I could see them. And it's just this tremendous little Technicolor film that I get to play in my mind whenever I want to think about them. But yeah,
it's great. That brings back memories of. I should bring back all grandparent memories with the cookies on the table. Grandpa's reading the newspaper. I can be there with you.
It's just tremendous.
It's a great memory.
This is my my mom was very, very important to us. Dad was gone a lot. Mm-hmm. And, it was interesting in the military. He never had what's called a remote, or a TDY, where you're stationed away from your family for a year or two. He insisted that we always go. And he even, story goes that he even just took us to Iceland and just showed up with us there. But he wasn't going to be away from us that long. But there were times that he'd have to be stationed away on missions as a sniper and part of this special operations team. And Mom was, of course, the one holding everything down, right? She's doing the bills and getting the kids ready and cooking the meals and changing the diapers. And she's doing that day after day after day after day. And she was my hero, and just tremendous lady. And this picture, my favorite picture of her, is this one where she's in Germany with Dad when they were stationed there before I was born. And she's pulling her, she's got her hair in some pigtails, and she's pulling her hair. It's just like one of my just favorite photographs of her. And she's just got the sweetest heart and just this beautiful person, just tremendous. And her family was very, very important to her mom and dad. And so as things were going to unfold, it was going to get very, very tough for Mom and for all of us. But we'll get into that. My mother, she had a hobby where she just loved quilts, and she would make quilts. And Mom would work, even though she didn't have to. She wanted to stay busy, and so she cleaned houses. And she would save this money, and she bought her own Z28. She'd always loved those hot rods. As a matter of fact, there's this great picture of me on Guam with my mom and dad, and they're holding me. And we're on the beach, Taragi Beach in Guam, with the duster, a blue duster. Oh. And it's just this tremendous shot. Of course, it rusted out really fast there. But Mom had this job where she would clean houses, and she saved up money and bought a Z28, and she had her eye on this quilt in just northwest of San Antonio is a Germantown, Fredericksburg, Texas, birthplace of Admiral Nimitz. And Mom had there's a quilt there that she had her eye on at one of the shops. And so she'd been saving money, and she had it in hand. And she, her and Dad decided to do a bed and breakfast. And this was 1999. Grandma had died the year before. And so, it had been pretty tough on her, and Dad wanted to do as much as he could to lift her spirits. And so they went to Fredericksburg. And, while they were gone, my not my grandmother, but my grandpa had been having a very hard time. Grandma had been with him his whole life, and pretty much, since he was 17, and now she was gone, and there was this tremendous void, and 50 years together, and the family was very concerned about him. But on this particular morning, he got up in the morning. He was very orderly, very neat. His shirts were always pressed and starched, and even his jeans, and always tucked in and had a belt. His hair was always combed. And so he in this particular morning up in Washington State, because he had to move there after Grandma died, he moved near my Aunt Ellen. And so he got his own place up there, and in this particular morning he was walking around and got everything in order, fed the cat. He wrote a little note on the table, and he took his wristwatch off and he put it in a Ziploc, and he took his wedding band off and put it in a Ziploc, and took his wallet out and put his ID on top of the wallet. And he wrote out another note. This one in particular was to my Aunt Ellen. The other one was a note of instructions. And I'm sure you can probably guess where this is going, but he walked over to the phone and dialed 911. And when he heard the operator say, 911, state your emergency, he shot himself. And they just heard, I have the police report, but they heard heavy breathing for a few minutes, and then it just silenced. So they did send PD, and they made entry and found my grandfather dead. Of course, that news travels quickly, and but Mom and Dad were gone, and so I'm there at the house with my sisters, and we get the call, Grandpa's killed himself. It just so happens that around that time, maybe 2 hours later, Dad called from a payphone, and he says, "Hey, how are things going at the house?" And of course I told Dad. And he turned and he said, "Dennis, I'm looking across the street and I see Mom coming out of the store. She sees me now. She has the biggest smile on her face. She's holding up the quilt. She's got it in her hand." He said, "I don't want to ruin Fredericksburg for her, so I'll tell Mom tonight at the house back in San Antonio." Steve, I think about, it's been many years, but yeah, I think about the love of my dad for my mom, to how tough that must have been to drive 70 miles and to listening to your sweetheart talk about what a wonderful time they had, and the whole time he knows what he's going to tell her, and that was just a terrible night. But my mom, I just was terrible. I just remember I ran to my room and I was punching my pillow as Mom was screaming, and I was just saying, it's not fair. It's not fair, and it was probably 2 years later. Mom was sitting at the kitchen table drinking coffee, and she had some gentle tears coming down, and I walked up behind her and I was just massaging her shoulders, and Steve, she just spun around and just looked at me with this fierce determination in her eyes, and she said, "I want you to find out what happened to Daddy during the war." And it was just so, the context, it was out of nowhere. And I says, "Okay, yes, of course I will, but why?" And she says, "I just have to know why Grandpa couldn't sit through a World War II movie without crying. I have to know why I would hear my dad scream in the middle of the night when I was a child." And I says, "Okay, well, what do we know?" And she says, "All I know is he was in the Navy." And I says, oh goodness gracious. Steve, being a World War II historian yourself, it's like, yeah, Pacific, Atlantic, stateside, like, goodness gracious. But I, of course, I said, "Okay, I'll do my best." And then Mom says, "You know what? I think, didn't Grandpa sign one of your books?" Now, I had a hobby, and one of my hobbies was collecting World War II veteran autographs since I was a kid. And so San Antonio is a tremendous convention city. So, along the Riverwalk, they've got the Hyatt, and they've got the Marriott, and they've got the Paseo del Rio, of course, all the attractions. And then a lot of the veteran community would get buses, and they would travel to Fredericksburg and go visit the National Museum of the Pacific War, and the Memorial Garden, and the home place of Nimitz. And so it's a tremendous city to be if you have a hobby where you collect World War II veteran autographs. I got to meet, of course, the Doolittle Raiders, the Flying Tigers, the Wasps, Tuskegee Airmen, Code Talkers, Chuck Yeager, the World War II Fighter Pilot Aces Association. I barged in there as a kid with my book. Steve Bessie, I want to say, or just a bunch of, I don't remember. There was just a bunch of fighter pilots, aces that I got their autographs. And of course, Chuck Yeager was like, oh my goodness. So if you have that autograph, Steve, you're darn tootin' going to get your grandfather's autograph.
Sure.
So, Mom said, maybe he put what ship he was on when he signed it. And then my heart was, oh my gosh, maybe he did. So I retrieved it from the bookshelf, flipped it open, and he signed it. Seaman First Class, Cliff Lemke, LCI 449, 1943 to 1945. And my mom says, now, Dennis, didn't he circle a map in the book? Didn't he circle islands where he had been? And I thought I remembered it. I was like, yeah, I think he did. So, of course, I flipped to that page, and sure enough, he circled Saipan, Guam, Tinian, and then he circled Iwo Jima. And that was tremendous. But what is an LCI 449, right? So,
right.
I figured Landing Craft Infantry, I figured that, but I thought it was what we envisioned for like Saving Private Ryan, where the troops, the ramp comes down and the troops run out. That's what I originally, of course now I know it was LCVP, but that I was thinking of. But that's originally what I thought the LCI was. And, we didn't have a computer at the house. We couldn't afford one. Internet at the time was very infant, and the dial up and the tones and loading a 16th of a page every few seconds. So it wasn't really an option as far as, digging in at that point. But slowly the internet started to grow. And meanwhile, I saw an advertisement in the newspaper for National LCI Association reunion in San Antonio. So that was tremendous. So I'm walking around, the Menger Hotel and the Alamo Plaza, and there's just guys everywhere with these blue hats with the gold stencil, National LCI Association. So, I'm stopping everybody. Did you serve on the LCI 449? No, son, I was on the 345, or no, I was on the 659 or the 1091, and I was 1091. Like, how many of these things were there? So it's like 449, 1091. Like, oh my gosh, like the chances are very small that I'm going to find anybody here from that one ship out of 1,091. But, you keep after it. And, of course, I got all their autographs. I had to. And then I was alongside the Riverwalk, and it was getting towards evening. And I saw two gentlemen reaching for their wallets. They had just stood from a table that abutted up against the river. And they were reaching for their wallets, and they stood, and they were looking at their tabs, figuring tips. I figured, just from what I could see. And I thought, okay, it's probably okay for me to approach. I didn't want to be rude if they were still eating. Mm-hmm. And so I walked up, and the fellows would turn out to be Bill Brinkley and David Cox, who was the chaplain for the association. And turns out David Brinkley wasn't even an LCI sailor. He was aboard a battleship Nevada. And I was soon to find out his significance. I said, sir, I was wondering, were you all on LCIs in World War II? My grandpa was on an LCI. And they says, oh yeah, which one? And I said, the 449. And, Bill Brinkley, he froze. And he turned and he looked at me. And Bill said, 449? Was your grandpa at Iwo Jima? I says, yes, sir. He says, did he survive? Of course, when you hear that, you realize that what that means. There's a bigger story there. And I said, yes, so why? He goes, what do you know about your grandpa's? I said, nothing. He goes, your grandpa was on a LCI 449 that had been converted into a gunboat. And they were at Iwo Jima on D-2. They were there on the February 17th. They took in underwater demolition teams. And they were doing a recon mission with the frogmen. And the Japanese thought it was the invasion. And they opened up with everything they had. Actually against orders. I would find out later that General Kobayashi didn't want them to open up fire yet. But they opened up, and he said, of your crew, Grandpa's crew of 70, there was 60% casualties. 21 were killed and 22 were wounded. And he goes, did you know that your grandpa's captain, Rufus Herring, was the first recipient of the Medal of Honor at Iwo Jima? No, I didn't know that. He goes, yeah. He goes, there's a story there. There's a lot to tell you. He said, he says, look, son, we're going to be here 3 more days. When I get home, I'll send you a current roster of everybody from the LCI 449 who's in our association. And that was off to the races at that point. It was just, the guys, then the names on the list that were Leo Bedell, Bruce Hallett, Charles Hightower, Anthony Serene, guys that I didn't know then, but that I was going to develop very close ties to and relationships with. And that was what got me started, was that chance happening there at the Alamo and taking a chance on stopping 2 guys reaching for their wallets to get the tip.
Very fortuitous approach.
Yes, sir.
For those who don't know, describe what the LCI was in general, and then, as you said, this 449 was converted into more of a gunship.
Sure. The John Niedermeyer, he invented the LST along with the help of the British. He was an American naval architect, and they came up with LST on the back of an envelope. They drew it out, and he also was responsible for the LCI. The idea was that they could mass produce these amphibious ships that would be able to be basically on the Henry Ford model, just turned out in just enormous numbers. And there were going to be, Niedermeyer insisted there could be no more than 5 of anything, no more than 5 angles, no more than 5 sizes, sheets of plate, no more, and it was all like 5s. And the LCI was a direct result. It was intended to land troops. The picture of the bow of the 449, if you look to the left and right, you see a little bit of a downward turn there along the sides of the ship. Now, what would have happened is that would have held ramps that would have come out. They would only be able to handle 1 soldier at a time. But the idea was that towards the front of the ship, there were 2 bars that would have protruded out, and they would have pulled the ramps out by pulley, extended them out in front of the ship, and then they would swing down and drop onto the beach. And off both sides of the ship, troops would pour out. This was actually done a lot on Normandy on D-Day. I know that the LCI group that was there, they were LCILs for landing craft, or for troops. I know that like the 85 and the 91, the 92, 93, they were all destroyed on Normandy, Omaha Beach. The 85 was sunk. I think there were 6 LCIs that were lost on Normandy Beach, which doesn't get a lot of attention, but they were very effective because they would carry a company. They would carry a company of troops. So you were able to hit the beach with a company of soldiers ready to go. At Anzio, as a matter of fact, the LCI number 1, the first LCI number 1, beached accordingly and beached right in front of several German pillboxes and machine gun positions. And if you look at the very tip, if you're able to see this on the 449, if you can imagine, there's a 20 millimeter gun right there, and there's a gunner. And the gunner on the LCI-1 took out those German machine gun positions at Anzio. Just tremendous courage, but they had that. So, after Tarawa, they discovered that, okay, well, we need better intel, right? We need more real-time information, not basing our landings on charts that are outdated. The remembrances of British captains or sea captains, who, though it did admit to the troops that the reef and the currents around Tarawa are dodging, but it's, they realized after that slaughter that they needed real-time information. And so that gave birth to two things. It gave birth to the UDTs, the frogmen that we call the Navy SEALs, and it gave birth to this close-in fire support vessel, the LCI gunboat. What better platform to provide cover for the frogmen than a ship that's designed to beach? And the way that they would do that is they would ram themselves, but before they would get to the beach, they would drop an anchor aft and they would coast into the beach, deliberately running ashore. And then when the troops were off, of course you have 200 troops that are off, it's lighter, and they would then winch themselves off the beach, pulling in reverse, and then engines reverse, and they would winch themselves off. So what better platform to provide cover fire for the frogmen than a ship designed to do that? So they played with the idea, and what they ended up doing was they took the ramps off of these LCIs and they converted them LCI-G for gunboat. Later there would be LCI-M for mortar, LCI-R for rocket. The G, though, did have, and in this particular picture of the 449, if you look to the left, you'll see what looks like curtains and bars that are jutting up a little bit. Those are actual covers that are covering the rocket pods. And so they did have, on the gunboats, they had rocket pods where the troops originally would have run out and approached the ramp and then descended. They put in those places rocket pods on each side of the gunboat. And in my grandpa's case, that's what they did. You can see the rockets there. And then you'll notice, though, that that's not a 20 millimeter on the bow of the 449. It's a 40 millimeter. And so what they did was, the design was they had 3 20s on the bow and 2 midships on the gun deck. They dropped those 2 down into the well deck, and they put 2 40s back by the conning tower, and then 1 in the bow. And so it was beautiful. They tried it out for the first time at Saipan, Guam, Tinian invasions, and the gunboats were so close that the dogs ashore were barking at them at night as they were coasting by, as the frogmen were going in at night. It worked beautifully, and it had some added benefits that they would find out at Iwo Jima the hard way.
That's the 40?
Yes, sir. That's a 40 millimeter there. You've got a pointer and a trainer. The trainer is on from our perspective, the trainer is on the left side and the pointer is on the right. And you'll see they have their hands on these handles. And one guy on they both spin them, and it makes the gun go left and right, and one makes it elevate and lower, and they worked in tandem looking through gun sights. And you'll see behind them there in the back is the feeder where the gun captain, the first loader, would drop the clips of 40 millimeter ammunition, 4 rounds a clip, and and then that's what I would find out later was my grandpa was an ammo passer on the starboard 40 millimeter, and they would just continuously pass ammunition to the guy. And you'll see in this picture, you can see there's tarps all around the gun shield, and those, if you were to pull the tarp off, you'll see that there are clips of 40 millimeter ammunition all in holsters all along the sides there. Yeah, but it was very primitive. It was an effective weapon, but very primitive as far as it's just eyesight. And you've got to be really good at coordination with your buddy. So this is the picture of the 449. So these photographs all came because of that original meeting at the Riverwalk in San Antonio. I did get the package, and I started calling the fellas, and they would send me the photos that they had. And so, to get fellas that are in their 80s, late 70s, early 80s at this time, to get them to go to Kinko's and make color photographs, and you're trying to explain, I know, yes, sir, Mr. Hightower, I know that there are black and white photos, but I need you to make color photos of the black and white photos because otherwise they're Xeroxed and they're too dark. So if you could, you walk them through all of that. But you also have to coax them to send you their photographs because it's inconvenient, right? And you're asking them to go to Kinko's and make photographs. So what I did was I had the idea, if you'll send me what photos you have, I will send you everything I get from everybody else. So they went from having a collection of 4 or 5 photos to every guy having about 100. So it was a really good deal. In this picture here, you see Hillman Ryan. He is mounted the 40 millimeter, playing a joke on his appendage there. And this looks like it's the Marshals, and they were at the invasions of Kwajalein and Weetok. And they did a lot of interesting operations with clearing out the Marshals, all the weather stations, and Bikini Atoll and Alingalapalap. And there were fellas who talked about seeing a briefcase with Amelia Earhart's initials stenciled on it in a hut. Can't be verified, but it is interesting to speculate on. But you can see this gives a really good view of the 20s where they were originally. And of course, my grandpa wasn't on at this point because he came on in May of 44. But so this was definitely the Marshals because they took the 20s and they dropped them down into the well deck. Yeah. Yeah, and so this is one of the photographs that I received from Leo Bedell. Leo Bedell was an officer on the ship, which of course was really exciting for me to get to talk to. There were 7 officers on the Iwo mission. 3 were killed, 3 were wounded, and the only officer not killed was Leo Bedell. And he had been in the Pacific about 3 months, and it was his first mission. And now he, as the engineering officer, he's in charge of damage control. So he comes up from below and sees this destruction. 3 guys are, actually 2 are dead. 1 is missing in action, never found. William Frederick Cooper is still listed as missing in action to this day. But, your skipper, Rufus Herring, is on the deck with his shattered shoulder, bones sticking out. Then he's handed the keys. You're in command. You've been in the Pacific for 3 months, and this is your first mission. And now you've got a ship that's within range of Japanese guns, and his ship's on fire, listing to port, taking on water. You've got the deck strewn with the dead, and the deck trim is right. One thing I'll explain to the folks when they talk about World War II and the Navy experience, which is why I kind of wish that they would make a mini-series about this gunboat and the crew, because, the typical naval experience was you never saw the enemy. They were always, right, they were either a kamikaze or there was a little tiny speck off in the distance. Many times you would go the entire war and never even see Japanese. But for the LCI gunboats, it was a totally different experience because they were within rifle range. They were interdicting Japanese swimmers going between islands. They were fishing them out of the water. At Saipan, they were along the cliffs of Marbai Point trying to talk the Japanese civilians out of committing suicide by the hundreds. So their experience was significantly different. And, explaining to families of the LCI veterans about their dads, and telling them that, the Marines and the soldiers, when their mission is to advance, right? You're advancing from this rock to that wall and trying to stay alive. And then you're advancing. And so when your buddy gets hit, you see him get hit, but you're advancing. And so then the medics come up and they remove him. And then he's just a fleeting memory of that snapshot of when that happened. But on the LCI gunboat 449, when the guys were killed and eviscerated and their body parts blown apart, these are your buddies. And now you're stepping through all of this grime and sludge of human remains that has piled on the ship, and you have to continue fighting the ship. You have to continue putting out fires and handy-billy pumps and trying to get water out, and you're still within range, and you're slipping and sliding and falling down in all of this grime and gristle from all of your buddies. And it was a horrific experience for these guys. And in this particular picture, this is a photograph from Leo Bedell of the survivors, of some of the survivors. My grandfather is first from the left, kneeled down, and right beside him is Charles Hightower. And behind him is Frank Blow, the bosun's mate, who, along with Leo Bedell, is credited with saving the entire ship. Like, I had the privilege of telling Frank Blow's family, like I'm here because of your dad, And so this is a survivor's picture. If you look above Frank Blow, you can see a bunch of hits in the dents in the ship. Also, you'll notice above the guys there at the back row, there's a rope. You can kind of see it off to the left. It comes down right above Frank Blow's head, right where his arm is stretched out. There's a rope, and it's attached to a tarp that is up towards the top. It's covering the giant hole that was blown out there from the mortar that hit them. They were hit 3 times at Iwo by mortars. And, that was one thing that always kind of haunted me, was the look on the guy's face. Right in the middle, of course, is a character, David Fletcher, with a big cigar in his mouth. He was always a big clown on the ship, and he was very, very helpful with lifting guys' spirits. But over what would be his left shoulder, is a guy there that's just got this haunting look on his face, William Hildebrand. And I would get to meet him, and he would come down, and we got to spend some time together and get to have dinner, and I got to meet him and get his story. But I got to meet in that picture. I got to actually meet Charles Hightower and William Hildebrand in that picture. Yep, and there's Charles Hightower. That's him, I believe, in Pearl Harbor. Great guy from Russellville, Arkansas. He was a barber his whole life, and I got to visit him. And when I went to go visit him at his house, we walked in, and I walked in and got to meet his wife and Billy. And he says, "You're going to stay with us tonight, right?" And no. Yes, of course. What did he say? The guy that's kneeling beside my grandfather, are you kidding me? Of course, I'm honored. Yes, and then you can see this picture here with our arms, which is this tremendous guy. But, he invited me to spend the night, and he took me to the guest room, and he pulls out out of a desk drawer, out of a dresser, he pulls out this little object. And he said, "Hey, I want to show this to you." And he pulls it out, and he does a quick little motion like that, and it unfurls, and it's a Japanese flag, and it's got all of the signatures from the guy's family and neighbors and friends from back home. And he tells me how that they had taken that off of a Japanese pilot who had actually bailed out of a plane over Saipan. P-38s had jumped his aircraft, and this Japanese pilot had shot him down. And he actually bailed out and was floating down, and they could see that he was going to land close to them in the water. So the skipper says, "All right, you guys, go get some weapons." So they open up the ammunition vault in the locker, and they come up with Thompsons and M1s and 45s. But when he was coming down, Charles looked up, and they could see the pilot was looking around, and all he saw was American ships everywhere. And I don't know. We can only speculate as to why he jumped out, because Maybe he thought that, maybe he believed the rumors that the Marianas were still in Japanese hands. But this was his very obvious, in your face, this is American property now. There everywhere was American ships. And as he was floating down, they saw him rummaging around, and he pulled out a knife and he started hacking at his lanyards. And he was successful, and so he plummeted to his death right beside the ship. And they fished him out and took the flag. That's the flag. And I had some really tremendous... One thing that I'll always be grateful about Charles Hightower was that he trusted me with stories he'd never told anybody his entire life. And there's something, Adam Makos, author, and, we're a lot very, very similar stories as far as, and I'm sure that we were probably crossing each other on the highways as we were crisscrossing in the country interviewing people. But he has that same bearing, you know what I mean? That same bearing that people just they feel comfortable with you. They know, they see your sincerity, they see your respect, your integrity, and they're going to trust you with the story. And later on, I would have people ask me, how did you convince 300 people to tell you about the worst day of their life? And, it was just something that we connected, and they saw in me that my heart and my integrity, and but Charles did trust me, and he opened up, and his stories were just absolutely riveting. Ralph Owens was his best buddy, and I don't want to ruin the story for people that read about it in the book The Heart of Hell, but there were some a lot of the details came from him. And we had many, many conversations, and he would cry sometimes, and I would cry sometimes. And thankfully they're recorded, But this is me there at his barbershop. And that was a really great moment. So, when your mom tells you to go find out what happened to Grandpa, you find yourself in places like Akron, Ohio, which is not a small drive from San Antonio. And I raised money. I worked in the ER, the trauma team, level 1 trauma center. And my ER buddies all raised, the nurses, the medics, the docs, the PAs, the residents, everybody raised money, and they raised a couple $1,000s for me, and they rented me a car. And I traveled through interviewing people in Arkansas and Missouri and Illinois, Indiana, Wisconsin, Ohio, and then I made my way over to Washington, D.C., the archives, and got to hold my grandpa. That's a funny story, Steve. I went to the archives. I don't know what I thought I was going to get, but perhaps I thought they were going to hand me Xerox copies of the deck log of my grandpa's ship, but they came out and handed me my grandpa's deck log from the gunboat, and I was just staring at them holding this thing with gloves, and they're interns, and they're looking at me, yes, sir, can I help you? And I'm like, this is the deck log from my grandpa's gunboat. They're like, yes. I go, and they just kind of like turned me around and gently pushed me towards the research desk. Go research. It was like, I couldn't believe that they would give me the original documents, but on that trip, I did make my way to Akron, Ohio, and I found the sister of Robert Minnick, who died on the ship. And he was somebody that several of the shipmates remembered, a very gregarious young man, a tremendous baseball player, actually was drafted right out of high school, but turned it down to serve. And when the reason that I found Robert's sister, Marianne, was I went to the Akron Public Library, and I just because, now, goodness gracious, now researchers have the capability of going to newspapersarchive.com or newspapers.com, right? But, you had to physically go there and go to the library and look at the, the microfilm and of the old newspapers. And so you just, roll after roll after roll and hour after hour after hour. But I did. I found Robert Minnick's mention in the Akron newspaper, and it mentioned his. And what was key about that, Steve, and for future people that want to do research, that want to write books in the future, what's key about getting obituaries is that it lists surviving family members. And a lot of times it will even list what city they are currently living in. So anyway, it was vital that I get that, and that's how I found out about Marion. And well, no, she doesn't know who I am, so I have to convince her that this 6'1" dude is okay to open the door for. So I learned a trick early on, so that when I knocked on the door, I already had a picture of Robert up that I got from the other guys. And so you can see here the look on her face and my face that we're very glad to talk with each other. And she gave me some tremendous photographs of him and some letters, and I took him to Kinko's and copied them, and then gave her copies of all my pictures. And she told me a story about how that, afterwards, because, they were all buried at sea per naval tradition. And she told me about how that there were stories that would be on the newsreels, how they had the movie tone news and whatnot. That there were stories of sailors or servicemen being found on islands. And so her mom had this idea that Robert might still be out there. She didn't understand the geography and the map of the Pacific and Iwo Jima, and that, he's not going to come back. And one day in 1946, she got the letter from the Navy Department, which, I understand they were taking care of their tidying up loose ends, but it was a year has gone by. Now we are officially, right? And so that just opened it all up again, and it's just like another nail. And it's like very sure all of her hope is gone. And Marion said that she couldn't find her mom, and she heard some rummaging around in the attic, and she crawled up there, and she saw her mom had Robert's cedar chest open and had his sweaters pressed to her face and was smelling them and crying. And, it's just, it's, those stories that just makes them so real. These folks, they're not just names. It gets like that, doesn't it? With World War II history, it's very easy to, and that's what's so wonderful about Band of Brothers and the Pacific. And, as it makes these guys real. And that's what this trip did for me, was it made my grandpa's shipmates just absolutely real people. And tremendous time. Part of the journey was going to Wisconsin. And, that's where my roots are. My mom and dad and grandparents, everybody, that's where they settled from Germany and Lithuania when they came across. That's where they settled. This picture here, you see me at Devil's Lake, Wisconsin. It's in the south. And what's interesting, Steve, I have a picture that my grandmother drew when she was 17. It's a pencil drawing. It shows a lady with a swimsuit on and a large bonnet hat and a large umbrella stuck in the sand. And she's sitting there in this beautiful flowing hair. And there's a young man with his swim trunks, and he's laying on the ground looking up at her. And I always thought maybe that was something she imagined, maybe in the Pacific, or maybe it was the Atlantic or something like that, but then when I went and did this research trip, I made my way to Baraboo, where Grandma Lemke grew up, Eleanor, and I made my way over to Devil's Lake. And if you look in that picture above me, you'll see in the background a beach. And when I emerged from the tree canopy and I came out onto Devil's Lake, Steve, have you ever been there?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So one thing they have a sand beach, and they have giant umbrellas stuck in the sand. And I realized at that moment, my eyes just filled with tears, because I knew immediately that Grandma had drawn a picture from her life, not an imaginary being on some beach on the Atlantic or the Pacific, but that was a memory from that lake, and that just meant so much to me. And then right next to the Devil's Lake was the Badger Ordnance Works, BOW. Mm-hmm. And I drove by there, and of course it's, shut down in the 70s, but there was a fellow out in front of this concrete building, an older gentleman, and he had a weed eater, and he was sweating profusely and sweeping the wet weed eater back and forth. And just, I learned early on, trust your instincts on research and just do it, right? Just pull over.
Yeah.
And I just pulled over, and I walked up to him, and he took his eyeglasses, protective gear out, and he's looking up at me, and can I help you? And I says, sir, my grandmother during the war worked here, and she was 17, and this is where she met my grandfather, because he was from the north woods of Wisconsin, hundreds of miles away, way up in the north, and he wanted to join when Pearl Harbor was bombed, and he was 17. And his dad had served, though, during World War I, and he was not going to sign for his son to go in at 17. So he had to wait. Well, he was flipping through the Park Falls newspaper, the Herald, and he saw the advertisement for Badge and Ordnance Works. And it advertised close to Baraboo, movies, commissary, free lodging, cafeteria, great job, good pay. And when you're 17 and yes, and so Fred, my great-grandpa Fred says, yeah, that's a good idea, go. So he got on the bus, went down, and that's where he met my grandmother. And she worked there. We've got this great picture of her with her overalls, and she's got her lunch pail and her hair up, and she still looks magnificent. She's going to work. Of course. She looks amazing, like a movie star. And, I would see her sometimes even when working in the garden. And, I'd say, why are you so dressed up? And she'd say, you never know when company might come by. But, my going there, and the fellow, turns out, was the director of the museum for the Badger Ordnance Works. And he opened it up for me. And he walked me around, and he pulled out from his database some old pictures like this one here. And things I never would have gotten if I hadn't stopped. And then when I made my way up to the North Woods to visit my Lemke family, met a lot of people I never met before, great aunts, great cousins. And my cousin Sally Meeks, great cousin Sally Meeks, she hands me this photograph. And she says, hey, I know this is about Clifford, but I wanted to give this to you. And it was an original. And it was this photograph here, as you see. And it shows my great-grandpa Fred sitting on the hood of his ambulance in France in 1918. And it just gave me goosebumps because I worked EMS for years on an ambulance. And to see that gene pop up in me, all those years later, 80, 90 years later, just to have that connection was just tremendous. Yeah, just tremendous. This is also Ohio, going to visit with the Ensign Leo Bedell. Leo was just this tremendous guy. And when I drove up, this is beautiful. Family in Wisconsin always makes fun of me because I always comment on the trees, because down here in South Texas, along the rivers, we've got trees, but everywhere else, it's just scrub, mesquite and cedar. But, Leo lives on one of those streets that's got, 50 different species of trees. And it's just this gorgeous street, and I'm driving down, and I park out in front of his house, and I'm walking up to meet him for the first time in person, and excited to meet him because he's the one that provided me the photo of my grandpa with the survivor crew. And I'm walking, and I hear this noise behind the house, and I kind of peek behind, and I see him, and he's cursing under his breath, and he's got this little cage, this little trap he's trying to set. And it's just not working. And he looks up and he looks kind of embarrassed because I heard him cussing. And he smirks. He's got that smirk and that picture there. And he says, these pesky squirrels, they keep tearing up my roof, and I'm trying to catch them and take them to the theme park. And so we laughed, and we went to the house, and I set up my tripod in the living room and my cassette recorder and my digital recorder, and I had backup to my backup because I had learned that early on. Some things inevitably there's going to be a gnome or a troll that's going to work its way into some kind of equipment. And anyway, we sat there, and he sat in that big chair, and I sat at the couch. And he was another one that just, as a matter of fact, his son Terry came afterwards. He took off some time from work, and he stopped by to see me and meet me. he says, Dennis, how'd the interview go? I says, it was tremendous. That moment when your dad, when they got hit on the bow, and your dad came around the conning tower, and that your dad said that leg flew from the front of the ship and flew over his shoulder. And Terry said, what? And I said, yeah, that, when your dad was in the leg. And he goes, I never heard that before. And, that was like a really real good evidence that these guys were telling me things that they had kept locked away. And then when we got done, we did a couple, sessions, and then it's time to eat. So we went to the kitchen, and his wife, she wanted to make sandwiches for us, and she was very feeble and not very able to walk, didn't have a steady gait. And the way that the kitchen was laid, it was kitchen counters on this side and this side, and she would shimmy very slowly over to this, and then she would turn and very slowly make her way over because she forgot a plate, or I need this ingredient, and she would go over, and I could see on Leo's face that it was kind of embarrassing him a little bit, and which was fine with me. It's just life, that's what happens, and didn't mean anything to me, but he felt he needed to address it, so he whispered to me. He said, she don't get around good anymore. And he said it really, really, real softly to me. And all of a sudden, from across the room, she blurted out, don't get around good, but my hearing's fine. He just immediately went red face, just red faced. He just got caught, it was so great. It was so great. Yeah, but it was Leo who told me about Howard Schoenleben. Yeah. He was a gunner's mate, 3rd class from Chicago. You wouldn't think that an officer and an enlisted guy would get that close, but it turns out that at Christmas, 1944, at Saipan, Howard Schoenleben and Leo Bedell would find themselves in a very unique position, because Leo went to Jesuit schools and Catholic and very devout, and wanted to go to Christmas Mass. So he took a small boat and put the word out. Anybody want to go to Christmas Mass? Taking the small boat into Saipan for Mass. And Howard Schoenleben was the only one, and they went in, and they got stuck on a reef, the tide. And so they spent hours on this reef, and they were flagging people. Everybody's ignoring them. And so what ended up happening is that they just sat and talked, and they got to know each other. And Leo found out about Howard's wife, and that he was married, and his family in Chicago, and this and that. And they got real close. And then when they were at Iwo Jima, if you recall, I mentioned that they got hit on the bow, and that leg flew from the front of the ship. That would have been from the bow 40-millimeter crew. But when Leo turned around the conning tower, he saw Howard Schoenleben, who was actually the gun captain for my grandpa's 40, the starboard side 40-millimeter. And Howard was there. Of course, he had his flak vest and the Mae West, and the helmet, and the blue flash guard paint on his face. And it was cold, so they had extra clothing on at Iwo Jima. And Leo saw that Howard's left arm was gone at the shoulder. It was actually dragging on the deck behind him as he was stepping. And Leo could see Howard's heart through the cavity in his chest. He could actually see his heart beating. And it just broke his heart. And he walked up to Howard, who was just stumbling around in a daze. And Leo put his arm around his waist, and he said, come on, buddy. And he took him around the backside of the conning tower where the pharmacist mate, Henry Buckman, had set up the first aid station. And, Henry Buckman saw Howard and was like, not going to put any time into him, So he just told him, give him some morphine. So Leo put him on the deck and held him, and gave him a couple syringes of morphine. And Howard looked at Leo, and he said, Howie, Howie, Howie. And then he closed his eyes. And of course he died. But Leo, when he was telling me this in the interview there in this living room, he says, I don't know what it means. I don't know what it meant. All these years, I don't know what it meant. And I was thinking about it. So I called up Charles Hightower, good old Charles, and I said, hey, you remember Schoenleben? He goes, yeah, I remember Schoenleben. Of course I remember Schoenleben. He goes, he was on the gun opposite us. I go, yeah. And he goes, he says, you know, Dennis, the mail caught up to us at Saipan, finally caught up to us before we shipped out. And Howard got a letter from his wife. And I just remember Howard running around the ship, waving this letter over his head. I have a son, I have a son. And his wife had named him Howard Jr., Howie. And so now I know, okay. Now I have a really good idea of what Howie means. And so I got to my computer. Of course, now that years have gone by and I've upgraded and I've got a computer, and because this was a 14-year journey of research. But by this time, so I go to the ussearch.com and I enter in what I know: Howard Schoenleben, Chicago, Illinois. Enter, and nothing. Right. So okay, broaden. Illinois, Howard Schoenleben. Enter. No hits. Okay. Howard Schoenleben, United States. Enter. And there was one hit, and it was an exact match, and it was in San Diego, California. And the approximate age was the exact age that I was looking for. So I called, left a message, he didn't answer. I says, I think my grandpa served with your dad. Please give me a call. A couple days go by, and I get this call, and it's Howard Schoenleben, and he says, hey, I appreciate the call, but I don't think my dad served with your grandpa because my dad was killed during the war. And now my heart is just like, oh my goodness. So I says, sir, was your dad killed February 17th, 1945 at Iwo Jima aboard LCI 449? It was real quiet. And he said, yeah. How do you know that? I says, my grandpa was there, and I have interviewed a lot of guys. I says, what do you know about your dad's death? He says, all I know is we got a letter saying he was buried at sea per naval tradition. That's it. I says, I have an amazing story to tell you. And I got to tell him that your dad said your name 3 times and died at Iwo Jima. And he told me, he says, later on when we got to meet several times, and he one of those meetings, he told me, he says, Dennis, at that moment, he had always just been a picture of just some guy, and he goes, man, he says, at that moment, you made him a dad for me. And what was amazing, Steve, was in Branson, Missouri, at our National LCI reunion, I got to walk up to Leo Bedell, and I says, Leo, I want to meet somebody. This is Howard Schoenleben Jr. And just to see that look on Leo's face, this shock, disbelief, and then he put his arm on his shoulder, and they walked off to a secret corner of the room and had a private conversation. And I was like, oh man, I should have put a digital recorder under that table and asked for forgiveness later.
Right.
Yeah, it's pretty
What
amazing.
A story.
So, through all the research and interviewing the guys, there were 70 guys on the Grandpa's ship, basically 70 guys on the Iwo mission. Fortunately, I got a roster from the ship of every single member. And so that was my goal, right? You got to find all these 70 guys. Now, of course, 21 died. So in those cases, I had to find family. And I did. I found family for every single guy that was killed. And of the 70, I think I'm up to 65 that I found. And then there was a couple that I wasn't able to find, but they were guys with the last name of, it was like Stein. And it was just like thousands, it was really hard. But even that case, in the case of Stein, I had his son reach out to me. So I actually got to pull him into the fold. But, after interviewing all the guys and getting a lot of contacts, I discovered that the story was a lot bigger. So I should probably know the story from the gunboats that were beside them on that day at Iwo. So I branched out and interviewed and researched. That's how I ended up finding about 300 people was that I ended up interviewing the guys from the battleships and the destroyers that were there and the other gunboats. And that's Bill Brinkley's story. Remember how Bill Brinkley alongside the Riverwalk? Turns out that he was on the captain of the Nevada. He was his signalman and radioman, and he had binoculars, and he saw this whole action that day, and it impressed him so much that he made it a life mission to tell their story. And so he was very instrumental and adopted into the LCI Association. So this event here that we had, it was in Fredericksburg, Texas, at the National Museum of the Pacific War. Have you had the opportunity to go there?
Oh, yes.
Okay, so yeah, tremendous place. And you'll see here, this is their memorial wall, very close to where the president stones are, the presidential stones. We were there to honor the gunboat. And it just so happened that fellows came from all over the states, and they from the other gunboats as well, and officers from the 474 that was sunk on the mission, and crew from the 471 and the 441, and we had family members come for guys that were killed on my grandpa's gunboat, including a Gold Star mother. Leona Bozarth came. Her son was killed. She was 99, and she came, and all of her children came. They were all still living. And so in the photograph here that you see along the memorial wall, you'll see on the left is Richard Holtby. He was in the pilot house of the 449. And of course, there on the right is my good friend, Charles Hightower. And they unveiled the plaque. And the plaque, it lists the entire crew. And it was very important to me that I put on there what happened to them. And in other words, if they were wounded or if they were killed or if they were given a medal. I know that many, many medals were given out. All the surviving officers were given medals. Leo Bedell was given a Silver Star. Rufus Herring, the Medal of Honor. Frank Blow, the Silver Star. Henry Buckman, the pharmacist, made a Silver Star. Several Bronze Stars were given out to members of the crew. But this plaque here was dedicated, and what better way than to have Richard Holtby and Charles Hightower lift the veil on this plaque at the National Museum of the Pacific War. And now I have the pleasure of taking my children there and showing them. And every time we visit Fredericksburg, we go and they put their fingers across Grandpa Lemke's name, and we pay our respects. And what was really great was that alongside, I have this great photo of two of my nephews there, and they're both in Navy uniforms. They're like 5 and 4, and they have their amphibious warfare patch with the red, with the gold eagle holding the Thompson and the anchor, and Seth and Austin. And Seth would later go on and join the Marines, and he just got out of the Marines and served. And Austin, who is currently in the Coast Guard, and it's just pretty cool.
Awesome. Well, Dennis, thank you for sharing the story up to this point. What we're going to do right now is switch over to our live broadcast and catch up with some of the questions that our audience members have for us, and then kind of wrap things up in just a few moments.
Sounds great.
Well, we appreciate you being with us tonight. Dennis is going to join us. There he is. In just a moment. Dennis, welcome back, and good to have you here. Thank you again for sharing the story. This has really been from almost a very simple question from your mom saying, "What did Grandpa do in the war?" has turned into not only discovering what your grandfather's story was, but also just a journey into the entire 449 story, and then being able to meet all the veterans who were there and who all make up a part of this. It's been, I think journey is probably the best word for it.
Yeah, it was just tremendous. It's very surreal, and that those relationships continue to this day.
Yeah.
It's just the Bedell family, the Johnson family, the Hilliard family, the Hildebrands, the Hallets. I mean, it goes on and on. All these relationships that were forged at Iwo Jima that continue to this day. It's pretty amazing.
You mentioned earlier that one of your early trips the people that you worked with at the hospital in healthcare raised money and helped you buy gas so you could go across country. When you came back, what was their reaction? Did they want to hear all of the stories?
Oh yes, yeah, it was tremendous. You know, they we had a big party, and of course they wanted to see all the photos, and they wanted to hear all the behind the scenes, and that was a lot of fun for me, was getting to show them video that I had shot, and some of the interviews and pictures from the trip. And what was really fun was a lot of the things that you weren't anticipated, that weren't on the schedule. Things like finding a librarian in Shelbina, Missouri, who's willing to open this creaky attic door for you to go through old documents, and that was just tremendous.
Yeah, and again, you mentioned Adam Makos, and I had a chance to talk to him a little while ago, and similar to you, at the time, a young person with an interest in World War II. And how did you, as Adam had to, overcome that sort of reluctance to talk about the experiences, first of all, from World War II veterans, but then also talk to you as a stranger and a young person? There's a little bit of an age gap there.
Absolutely. I'd really be curious to hear what Adam has to say about that too, because, that was a huge hurdle. And, originally, it for some guys it was unsurmountable, but I did learn one particular case, Junior Hollowell. I called him up, and he shouted into the phone, "What do you want?" And it just startled me, and so it stunned me, and I didn't answer, and he hung up on me. And so then I said, "Oh my goodness, I got to get it together." So then I called him back, and he's again just, "What do you want? What are you calling me for?" And I said, "Oh, my name is Dennis. I'm calling from San Antonio." Slam. He hung it up again the second time, and then, then you start to realize, oh man, this isn't going to happen. And then, my folks were like, "Yeah, but what if he knows some really good information? Like, give it one more try." So then that's why I would really wonder what Adam would say, because it's like, what I ended up doing was I called a third time, right? And "What do you want?" And I just said, "LCI 449. And he says, it got quiet, and he says, "What about it?" And I was, all right, doors open, here we go. Right. So then it was off to the races, and I got just tremendous stuff from him that just opened up. It was great.
Awesome.
But I think that most importantly though is that they saw the sincerity. Right. And they felt it. They could hear it in your voice. You ask good questions. You're respectful with the questions you ask. One, of course, it helped that my grandpa was one of their shipmates. Mm-hmm. But I think it really does come down to if they feel that energy. People have energy, and I feel like that sincerity.
How long did it take between the time that your mom asked the question and you got to the point where there was actually enough material for the book?
Yes, so that would have been 14 years, probably 12 years. And then 2 more years of once I got with Mitch Weiss, Pulitzer Prize-winning author, once I got with him about it, there were gaps. And so then the next 2 years was, let's fill these gaps. And
okay.
Yeah.
Which leads to the next question. Mitch Weiss is actually credited as the author, even though you did the lion's share of all the research that went into it. What was the process there?
Yeah, so I wrote a manuscript, and I wasn't an author. I wrote a manuscript, and to me it read like a textbook, and it wasn't what I was looking for. And I had, around that time, I read a book called No Easy Day, and it was about the mission that got bin Laden, written by Kevin Moore. I love the style. I approached him. He said, "Well, I've got 3 books in the works. I can't do another. I'm going to pass you to my buddy, Mitch Weiss, who's looking for a project." And so Mitch and I talked, and we just says, "What have you got?" He says, "If it's going to be any good, we're going to need 25 interviews." And I says, "Well, I've got 300. He says, "Oh my goodness gracious." So, we talked, and we talked about the getting it done. And he told me the realities of publishing, because we did get it done with Random House Penguin Books. So it was a major publisher. And he's a Pulitzer Prize-winning author. And so, you know, he was upfront with me and told me that he did not want to share the credits on the front. He had done that his whole career, and he was looking to branch out and do it on his own. So it was very upfront, and that I knew that I wasn't going to be on the cover. Grandpa was, of course, one of the main characters, and my story with research is in the epilogue. There were other deals that were made regarding royalties and all that, but you know, it was just one of those things where he says, if you want to do it, you'll have to agree not to be on the cover. So then that, you know, there were some quiet moments of, you know, looking at all the work I had done, you know, interviewing 300, you know, people, traveling across the country, then transcribing all the interviews, which is thousands of pages, transcribing, listening to them over and over and over, rewind. Did I hear that right? And you're rewinding again, pause, you know, and it's just, you know, it just takes forever, but you do it because then you can go into Microsoft Word and put in a keyword Guam, and anybody who ever mentioned it is going to show up, right? So you have to do the transcribing. And, you know, so it was, you know, I'm thinking about all that work, and, you know, it was my mom and dad who had the good questions, and they were like, you know, what is your goal? And I was like, well, my goal is that everybody find out what happened to this gunboat and crew. No one knows this even happened at Iwo Jima 2 days before the invasion. And they says, well, what's your readership if you self-publish? And I was like, oh, that was a gut punch. Right? Because like you said, Dennis, that your goal is to get this out to as many people as possible. So I says, well, maybe 1,000 people after friends and family, and selling it at flea markets. And they says, how about if you do it with Mitch? And I says, well, sky's the limit, you know. So I called him up and says, let's do it.
So your goal was reached. I mean, the story is getting out.
The goal was definitely reached, and I became a beneficiary of. He actually had me write the Japanese chapters in the book. Oh. And so I got the extra benefit of him walking me through writing processes and how to establish outlines, and just tremendous stuff that I would use then later for the books that I wrote with my dad, and then a book about my ER career and whatnot. So yeah.
A little mentorship never hurts.
Oh, it was just amazing. I mean, you can't, you know, that tuition, you can't beat it.
Yeah. One of our viewers is wondering if Bill Brinkley was on the Nevada December 7th, 41?
No, he was not. No, he came on later.
Okay. Yeah. Good. Well, I think we've got all of our questions from the audience. You mentioned a couple of books that you've written and something new coming up. What's on the horizon for you?
Yes, so I wrote a book called Clear on Amazon. It's about, it's all caps. It's about my 23 years in EMS and ER. Timothy McVeigh, who got me into EMS, courtesy of the Alfred P. Murrah building, which he blew up. I was in college at the time, and our building shook, and that's what got me into it. And then I just finished a manuscript on a short story series that I'm doing. The first one is going to be about the suicide cliffs at Saipan. And during the interviews that I did with a lot of the guys, some of them guys mentioned the suicide cliffs, bonsai cliffs at Saipan. And so I'm just going to be doing a short story series of books, as well as some other stuff that I'm working on. I'm probably going to call it, you know, short stories of World War II, and then this one will be gunboats at Bonsai Cliff.
Okay. Great. We will look for that. You can, Dennis, your EMS book is available on like Amazon or other booksellers?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. If you put in Dennis Blocker, you'll see EMS book, and then you'll see the two that I did with my dad about his time in Iraq with K9, German Shepherds, and Belgian Malinois in Afghanistan as well. And yeah.
And the Heart of Hell, search for that one as well. But of
Heart
course,
of Hell, yes, sir. That's available everywhere.
Mitch Weiss is the author. Yes, exactly.
Everywhere. And I will say that one of the greatest moments of the whole thing was it was published in March of 2016, and we had arranged to have the first copy off the press. And so we took Mom under false pretenses to the Tower of America, the restaurant on the top there. And the whole family was there, and clinked the glass, and I stood up, and everybody got quiet and was looking at me. And I says, just think, Mom, right now, the heart of hell is on aircraft. It's on UPS trucks. It's zipping across the country, going to different locations. And everybody's going to get theirs on Monday, but not you. She was like, what? And I reached under the table and I pulled out the book. I said, because you get the first one.
Wow.
And that jet journey of all those years ago, when you looked at me and you said, I want you to find out what happened to Daddy during the war. And I handed her the book and I said, well, here's your answers.
Wow.
That was amazing. Never forget it.
I can imagine. I can't imagine. That's what a way to bring the story to a closure, or at least this portion of the chapter is you finally answered her question from all those years ago.
Yeah.
And when she read the book, I mean, had you been keeping her up to date on some of the things that you had found out, or was this she read the book to understand her father's?
Sure. I would show her pictures, especially when Leo Bedell sent the picture that had Grandpa in it, the survivor picture, kneeling in front of the conning tower, riddled with shrapnel. So I would show her things like that. And so, she would get tidbits here and there, but they're out of context. And, so she actually wrote me a 6-page letter when she was done. And she's not a reader. And she read the book in 2 days. And it was a 6-page letter, and basically it was that she wished that every child of a crew member could read the book, because that maybe they would understand why their dad was distant, or why he wasn't as loving as you could tell. Like even Grandpa, you could tell that he wanted to show affection, and he would have a tear in his eye, but he just, something had died in him. And she said that the book just answered so many questions. One of the things and one of the benefits that came to it too, Steve, was that one of the veterans, William Wilcox, he was wounded there on the mission, and he's a farmer up in Illinois. And I was talking to him. I check in on the fellows, every once in a while, and he was telling me that he had to move out because of his health, and farmhouse they'd had forever. And he felt bad, and he was worried because he didn't know how he was going to take care of his wife. And I told him, well, you should have disability. You were wounded. And he says, well, I don't have any documentation. And because it was destroyed in a flood. And I says, man, I've got all that. I got that from the archives. And so I was able to send him all that, and he was able to get the government then got him disability, and he was able to get. So that was just, and there were several stories like that of those documents that just because of my mom years before saying, I want you to find out what happened to Daddy, the ramifications and the ripple effect of that simple question, and a son's love for his mom to keep pushing and to keep after it,
An amazing story. Again, Dennis, thank you for joining us and sharing what was not only a very unknown story, but also very emotional for you, and I think for everyone who's watching tonight. You can really understand some of what they went through, but we'll never understand all of it. So again, thank you. And
absolutely, thank you for having me.
Yeah, and thank you for joining us tonight. As always, if you have any ideas for a future topic you'd like to hear about, please send Leah Block an email at media@cafhq.org. Until next time, I'm Steve Buss. Thank you for joining us here at CAF Warbird Tube.